Late one night, Tony discovers a series of text messages revealing Flora's affair with John. Shocked and heartbroken, he confronts her in a whirlwind of anger and betrayal. In that heated moment, a chilling plan begins to take shape, setting off a chain of events that will change everything. What happens when trust is shattered? Will love survive betrayal? Find out as we dive into a tale of ambition, deception, and a chilling crime. Tony is a devoted husband. He works hard to make his dreams come true. He has a startup, but it's struggling. He often feels like he is not enough for Flora. His loyalty is strong, but doubt begins to creep in. He worries about their future and fears losing Flora. He spends long hours trying to secure investors, hoping to impress her. Flora is ambitious and desires a life filled with luxury. She dreams of wealth and success, but she feels frustrated with Tony's slow progress. Her patience is wearing thin. Flora wants a lavish lifestyle and often thinks about what she is missing. She feels trapped in her current life. The pressure builds as she watches her friends enjoy riches while she waits for Tony to succeed. John is Flora's charming boyfriend. He has a smooth way with words. He knows how to make Flora feel unique and desired. He encourages her to go after what she wants, even betraying Tony. John sees Flora as a way to get what he wants too. He manipulates her feelings, planting seeds of doubt about Tony. With his charm, he draws Flora into a secret world of lies. The story unfolds against the backdrop of a high-stakes business pitch. Tony is preparing to present his startup idea to a panel of investors, much like in a Shark Tank setting. This is his chance to impress Flora and prove himself. He believes that if he succeeds, their lives will improve. The day of the pitch arrives. Tony wears a crisp suit, trying to hide his nerves. He rehearses his speech, envisioning a future where he can provide everything Flora dreams of. His passion for his project shines through, but a fear of failure lurks in the back of his mind. Flora watches from the audience, her face a mix of support and impatience. She hopes he will impress the investors, but her thoughts drift to life if things were different. As Tony stands before the investors, he pours his heart into the pitch. He talks about his vision and the hard work he has put in. The investors nod, but there's skepticism in their eyes. Tony finishes his presentation, and the silence is deafening. He feels a wave of disappointment washes over him. At that moment, he can't shake the feeling that he's falling short in business and life. Meanwhile, Flora's attention wavers. She's torn between supporting Tony and her growing frustration. She looks at her phone, where John has been texting her. His messages are filled with encouragement, making her feel unique and desired. As Tony stands on stage, her connection with John pulls at her heart. Backstage, Tony awaits the investors' feedback. He hopes for positive news that will reassure Flora. But as he walks off the stage, he sees her texting John. A knot forms in his stomach. Doubt and fear consume him. Flora, caught up in her feelings for John, starts to think about what she truly wants. She loves the idea of being with someone who shares her dreams of wealth. John paints a picture of a life where money is no object. He tells her she deserves more than what Tony can offer. Flora begins to see Tony as a hindrance to her dreams. In the days that follow, Flora and John grow closer. They share secret moments and dreams of a life filled with luxury. Flora feels alive when she is with John, but guilt creeps in. She knows she's betraying Tony, but her desire for a better life pushes her forward. Flora and John's affair began quietly. They met at a coffee shop, sharing stolen glances and whispers. Flora felt a spark with John that she hadn't felt in a long time. He made her laugh and dream of a better life. As their secret meetings continued, Flora found herself drawn to John. They met in secret places, away from prying eyes. In dimly lit corners, they shared stories and plans. John listened as Flora poured out her frustrations about Tony. He made her feel understood and special. One evening, they met in a cozy hotel room. The air was thick with excitement and risk. Flora felt alive. John wrapped his arms around her and they kissed. It felt thrilling to be with him, away from Tony's watchful eyes. In those moments, Flora felt a rush of freedom. She was no longer just Tony's wife. She was someone new. As they lay together, John whispered sweet promises. "You deserve more than this life," he said. "With me, you can have everything." Flora's heart raced. She was tempted by his words. Together they began to dream of a life filled with wealth and luxury. Their conversations shifted to plans. John had ideas about how to use Tony's business for their gain. "We can make this work," he said. "If you play it right, you can help me, and we both can benefit." Flora listened closely. The thought excited her. They discussed manipulating Tony's investments. Flora thought about the startup Tony was working on. "If he trusts me, I can get him to sign over some assets," she said, her voice filled with determination. John smiled, encouraging her. "That's the spirit. You'll be free, and we can start fresh." Flora felt a mix of guilt and thrill. She loved Tony, but the passion with John was intoxicating. Each secret meeting pushed her closer to making a choice. They began to plan how to approach Tony. "Maybe you can suggest investing more in the business," John suggested. "If you get him excited about the potential, he'll be more willing to let you help." Flora nodded, considering the idea. "I can do that. He trusts me." The more they plotted, the more Flora's feelings for John grew. She began to see Tony as a barrier to her dreams. John painted a picture of a life where money flowed freely. Flora wanted that life. She tried to escape the feeling of being trapped. Their secret meetings continued. They would meet under the cover of night, laughing and making plans. Flora felt a thrill each time, knowing she was living a double life. But with each encounter, the weight of her choices grew heavier. One night, Flora and John met at a park. The moon was bright and the air was cool. They sat close together on a bench. John took her hand and looked into her eyes. "What do you want, Flora?" he asked softly. "I want more," she admitted. "I want to feel alive. I want to be someone." John smiled, squeezing her hand. "We can have that together. You just need to leap." Flora's heart raced at the thought. Could she betray Tony? The man who loved her and worked so hard? But the lure of the life John promised was strong. As their plan took shape, Flora found herself lost in the fantasy. She began to think about how she could claim Tony's assets. The thought excited her. It felt like freedom. But deep down, she battled with guilt. In the following days, Flora carefully approached Tony about his business. "What if you expanded?" she suggested. "There's so much potential if you invest a little more." Tony looked at her, his eyes brightening with hope. "You really think so?" he asked. "Yes," Flora replied, forcing a smile. Inside, her heart raced. She was playing a dangerous game, but she needed Tony to trust her. She needed him to believe in her idea. As the days passed, Flora kept meeting John. They planned every detail. John was persuasive, always pushing her to take risks. "You have to think about your future," he would say. "With me, you can have everything you ever wanted." Flora felt the pull between the two worlds. With Tony, there was love and loyalty. But with John, there was excitement and ambition. Each meeting with John fueled her desire for change. The more Flora thought about their plan, the more she wanted to go through with it. She imagined a life where she wasn't just Tony's wife, but a powerful woman in her own right. With John by her side, anything felt possible. But deep inside, the guilt lingered. She loved Tony. He trusted her completely. Flora knew she was playing with fire, but the thrill of the affair was hard to resist. As their secret relationship deepened, Flora stood at a crossroads. Would she choose love or ambition? The stakes were high and the consequences could be devastating. The choice loomed before her, and she felt the weight of her decisions pressing down. In the end, Flora faced a moment of truth. The thrill of the affair and the allure of wealth pulled her in one direction. But the love she once felt for Tony whispered in her heart. What would she choose? The answer would change everything. What dark plan unfolds when love turns to greed? Can a betrayal lead to murder? Discover the shocking twist in Flora and John's dangerous game. Flora and John sat in the dim light of a cafe. They whispered, their eyes darting around. The air was thick with tension. They needed a plan to get what they wanted. Flora was determined to take control of Tony's life. "Here's what we'll do," John said, leaning closer. "You need to get Tony to sign over his property and shares of his business. Frame it as a smart move for your future." Flora nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and fear. She knew it was risky, but the reward was tempting. Flora thought about how to convince Tony. "I can tell him it's for security," she said. "If we invest together, it will help his business grow." John smiled, encouraging her. "Exactly. He trusts you. Use that to your advantage." They discussed the details of their plan. Flora would approach Tony after a long day at work. She would act sweet and supportive. John suggested, "Make him feel like it's his idea. The more he thinks it's smart, the easier it will be." As Flora prepared, she felt a knot in her stomach. She loved Tony. He had always been good to her, but the desire for a better life with John pulled her in. She tried to shake off the guilt. "It's just business," she reminded herself. "I need to think of my future." The next evening, Flora set the stage. She cooked Tony's favorite meal and set the table with candles. When Tony arrived home, he smiled at the sight. "Wow, this looks amazing," he said, his face lighting up. Flora felt a pang of guilt, but pushed it away. As they ate, she started to plant the seed. "Tony, have you considered expanding your business?" she asked casually. Tony paused, looking thoughtful. "I have some ideas, but it's hard to know where to start," he replied. Flora leaned in, her voice sweet and soft. "What if you let me help you? We could invest together. I want us to secure our future." Tony looked at her, surprised but intrigued. "You really think so?" he asked. "Yes, we could do great things together. You just need to trust me," she said, her heart racing. She could see Tony's excitement growing. Days passed, and the tension between them thickened. Tony was eager to talk about his business, but Flora noticed he was starting to sense something was off. He would look at her with questions in his eyes, yet he was blinded by love and trust. He wanted to believe everything was fine. Flora and John met again to discuss the next steps. "We need to move fast," John said. "Tony is catching on. If he gets too suspicious, it will ruin everything." Flora nodded, feeling a rush of fear. "I'll keep acting normal," she promised. As the plan progressed, Flora felt trapped. She was living a lie, and each day grew harder. The guilt lingered, but the thrill of what they could gain pushed her forward. She pictured a life filled with wealth and excitement with John. Finally, the day came. Flora decided it was time to put the plan into action. She would convince Tony to sign the papers and frame it as a way to help them both. Little did she know that this choice would lead them down a dark path that could change everything forever. In the quiet of their home, Flora prepared herself. She knew she had to be convincing. She took a deep breath and thought of the life she wanted. The stakes were high and the risk was great. But Flora felt ready to leap. The tension in the air was thick. She stepped into the living room where Tony waited, unaware of the storm brewing. Would she succeed, or would her plan unravel? The moment of truth was at hand. What happens when love turns to rage? Can a moment of anger lead to a shocking crime? Discover the chilling truth behind Flora's dark choice. The air in the room was tense. Flora could feel her heart racing as she faced Tony. She had been planning this moment for weeks. She needed to confront him about their future. She knew it was now or never. "Tony, we need to talk," Flora said, her voice steady but cold. Tony looked up from his work, surprised. "What's wrong?" he asked, sensing her serious tone. Flora took a deep breath. "I want you to sign over your business and property to me and John. It's the best way for us to secure our future," she said. Her voice was firm, but inside she felt a wave of fear. Tony frowned, confusion crossing his face. "What? Why would I do that?" he asked, disbelief in his eyes. "This is my hard work. Why would you want to take it away from me?" Flora felt anger rising. "Because it's for your own good," she snapped. "You need to trust me. I'm trying to help." Tony shook his head. "This doesn't make any sense. I've worked too hard for this. You can't just expect me to give it away." His voice grew louder, filled with hurt and anger. Flora felt her temper flare. "You don't understand. You're too blind to see what's best for us," she yelled. "I'm trying to build a future, and you're holding me back." The argument escalated. Harsh words flew between them, cutting deeper than any knife. Tony's eyes were filled with hurt, but Flora was blinded by rage. She had been pushed to her limit. In that moment of fury, something shifted inside her. The anger boiled over, and she felt a dark urge rise within. "You won't listen, Tony," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "Maybe you need to learn a lesson." Tony stared at her, shocked. "What are you talking about?" he asked, fear creeping into his voice. Flora took a step closer, her heart pounding. "If you won't cooperate, then maybe you don't deserve to be in my life," she said, her voice cold. In a fit of rage, Flora made a choice. She had thought about it before, but now it felt real. The thought of murder rushed through her mind like a storm. She wanted to silence him, to end the fight for good. Flora had planned this moment, but she had never imagined it would come to this. She felt a mix of fear and power. She grabbed a nearby kitchen knife, the blade gleaming in the light. "Flora, don't!" Tony yelled, his voice shaking. But it was too late. The rage inside her took control. In a swift motion, she lunged at him. The act was brutal and shocking. Flora didn't recognize herself as she committed the crime. In that instant, she transformed from a wife into a murderer. As Tony fell, the reality of what she had done hit her. The room was silent, except for her heavy breathing. The weight of her actions crashed down on her. Flora stared at the scene, frozen in shock. She had crossed a line she could never return from. The plans she had made with John felt distant now. The dream of a better life was replaced with a nightmare. In the aftermath, panic set in. What would she do next? How would she hide this? The questions raced through her mind, but deep down, she knew there was no turning back. She had chosen her path, and it was dark and full of consequences. As she stood there, Flora realized her life had changed forever. The betrayal, the rage, and the crime would haunt her. She was trapped in a web of her own making, and there was no escape. What happens after a shocking crime? Can love survive when dark secrets come to light? Join Flora and John as they face the aftermath of their deadly choice. Flora stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling. She looked at the mess around her. Tony was gone, and she felt a mix of fear and relief. John arrived soon after, his face lighting up when he saw her. "We did it," he said, a grin spreading across his face. "Yes, but we need to act fast," Flora replied, trying to keep her voice steady. They quickly began to cover up the crime. They cleaned the kitchen, hiding any evidence of what had happened. Flora felt a rush of adrenaline as they worked together. They wanted to make it look like an accident. "We can say he fell," Flora suggested, her mind racing. John nodded, his eyes shining with excitement. "That's perfect. No one will suspect a thing." After cleaning, they sat together, feeling like they had won. They had taken control of their lives, or so they thought. They began to talk about their future. "Now we can finally be together," John said, squeezing Flora's hand. Flora smiled, her heart racing with hope. "Yes, we can start fresh. No more worries." They laughed and made plans, dreaming of a life filled with luxury and freedom. The thrill of their victory felt intoxicating, but as days passed, cracks began to show. Flora noticed small things that made her anxious, the way the neighbors looked at her, the whispers she could hear behind her back. She felt the weight of their secret growing heavier. One evening, the news came on as Flora and John relaxed on the couch. The anchor reported on Tony's death. "Authorities suspect foul play," the anchor said. Flora's heart sank. She turned to John, fear in her eyes. "What if they find out?" John quickly calmed her down. "Don't worry, we're careful. No one will connect us to this." But the doubt lingered in Flora's mind. In the following days, the tension built. Flora avoided going out, fearing someone would ask questions. She felt trapped in her own home. John tried to reassure her, but she could see the worry in his eyes too. One night, they were in bed, and Flora couldn't sleep. "What if they find evidence?" she whispered. John sighed, pulling her closer. "We just need to stay calm. It's been days. They won't find anything." But Flora wasn't convinced. She started to notice every little sound, every shadow outside. Each day felt longer, filled with anxiety. The joy they had felt after the murder faded into a distant memory. Then one afternoon, Flora received a call from the police. Her heart raced as she answered. "We need to ask you some questions about Tony," the officer said. Panic flooded her body. She quickly glanced at John, who looked pale. "Sure, I'll cooperate," Flora replied, trying to keep her voice steady. After she hung up, she turned to John, fear etched on her face. "What if they suspect us?" John's expression turned serious. "We need to stick to our story. Just act normal." But Flora could see the cracks in his confidence. The weight of their lie felt like a heavy chain. The day of the police visit arrived. Flora tried to prepare herself. She wore a calm smile as they entered her home. The officers asked questions about Tony, and she answered as best as possible, but inside she felt like she was drowning in fear. As the officers left, Flora felt a wave of relief, but the cracks continued to grow. John's demeanor changed. He became more distant, and Flora sensed his fear. They had built their life on a lie, and the truth was clawing its way back. In the days that followed, Flora and John struggled to hold on to their victory. They celebrated their plans, but the joy felt hollow. The shadows of their past loomed large, reminding them that secrets rarely stay hidden for long. The future they dreamed of felt like a fragile illusion. The police launched an investigation into Tony's death. They arrived at Flora's house, ready to ask questions. Flora felt her heart race. She had to act shocked and sad. When the officers interviewed her, she put on a sad face. "I can't believe he's gone," she said, tears welling in her eyes. She feigned grief, trying to convince them of her innocence. But as the investigation continued, evidence began to surface. The police spoke to John, who had a shaky alibi. He claimed he was at work during the time of the murder, but his story didn't match up. The officers took note, sensing something was off. Then they found a series of text messages between Flora and John. The messages hinted at their secret relationship and showed plans they made together. Some texts even suggested a motive. "We need to take control," one message read. The police began to piece together the truth. Flora felt the walls closing in. She hadn't expected the investigation to go this far. As the police dug deeper, she knew she had to be careful. She had to keep her story straight and hope that John could maintain his alibi. The tension grew as the investigation unfolded. Every new piece of evidence felt like a step closer to uncovering the truth. Flora's heart raced with fear. Would they discover what really happened to Tony? Would her life unravel before her eyes? The police arrived at Flora's house early one morning. They had uncovered evidence against her and John. The tension in the air was thick. Flora's heart raced as she saw the officers. "Flora and John, you're under arrest for the murder of Tony," one officer announced. Flora felt disbelief wash over her. "This is a mistake. I didn't do anything," she cried, panic rising in her chest. John stood beside her, but his face was cold. "I didn't know it would come to this," he muttered, his voice trembling. Flora looked at him, shocked. "What do you mean?" she asked, hurt flooding her heart. John turned away from her, avoiding her gaze. The police began to put handcuffs on both of them. Flora felt tears well up in her eyes. She couldn't believe this was happening. She had thought they could get away with it. As they were led away, Flora's mind raced. How had everything fallen apart so quickly? She realized that the life she dreamed of was slipping away, and she was left with nothing but regret. Can Flora convince everyone she is innocent? Or will the truth come out? Don't miss the intense trial. The courtroom was packed. Friends and family filled the seats, anxious to hear what would happen. Flora sat at the defendant's table, her heart pounding. Emotional testimonies came first. Friends spoke about Tony's kindness. Family members shared stories of his hard work. Each word made Flora feel more isolated. Then the forensic evidence was presented. The prosecution showed how everything pointed to premeditated murder. They revealed the text messages between Flora and John, suggesting a plan. The room grew tense as people whispered. Flora's defense team tried to paint her as a victim. She was under pressure, they argued. This was a mistake, not murder. But the prosecution had a strong case. They described Flora's manipulative nature, showing how she had tricked everyone around her. Flora listened, feeling the weight of the evidence against her. The truth was closing in, and she knew she had to fight. But as the trial continued, she realized the chance of escaping her fate grew smaller. The courtroom drama unfolded, revealing her life in a way she never expected. What will happen when the jury decides Flora's fate? Can she accept the truth as the sentencing unfolds? Witness the dramatic conclusion. The courtroom was silent as the jury returned. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the verdict. Flora sat nervously, her heart racing. When the jury announced their decision, it felt like a thunderclap. "We find the defendant guilty of murder." Flora's heart sank. She couldn't believe it. The judge spoke next. "Flora, you are sentenced to life in prison without parole." Her eyes filled with tears. Life as she knew it was over. John sat nearby, his expression blank. He had cooperated with the police and his sentence was reduced. He would serve only a few years. Flora glanced at him, feeling betrayal. How could you? She thought, hurt flooding her heart. As the gavel struck, Flora was led away in handcuffs. The weight of her actions hit her hard. She had lost everything, her freedom, her dreams, and the life she once had. The courtroom doors closed behind her, sealing her fate. The reality of her choices settled in. There was no way back now. Betrayal leaves deep scars. Tony's family mourns his loss, filled with grief and confusion. They can't believe he's gone. Meanwhile, Flora sits alone in her prison cell. She finally understands the consequences of her choices. The scandal shakes the community, rumors spread, and trust is broken. Flora's story becomes a cautionary tale about ambition gone wrong. Like and subscribe for more stories that make you think.